Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, with a news flash. Norrington retires. Warmth returns to string playing the world over. Finally, the day had to come. Of course, for the past few years, he's been hanging out with the Royal Northern Sinfonia, which is hardly a place where he would have the opportunity to torment us with his demented view of what passes for musical interpretation. But now that he's stepping off the podium at age 87 or so, which is about 80 years later than it should have been, I think it's time to consider Roger Norrington's career and see how it was possible that this man got where he got, because it was a very, very interesting concatenation of circumstances. You may recall that Norrington's career began as the conductor of the Schutz Choir, so he was an early music specialist. He also made a DVD of Tippett's opera King Priam. Now, love them as we may, neither Schutz nor Tippett were the ticket, get it? Tippett is not the ticket to overnight fame and success. What Norrington did was hitch himself to the period instrument bandwagon with something called the London Classical Players. Now, the London Classical Players were part of the English early music mafia of the 70s and 80s. These were all the same 5 people who showed up for every single concert under a different name. They were the Academy of Ancient Music, they were the English Concert, they were the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, they were the Hanover Band, they were the London Classical Players, they were the Monteverdi Choir and Orchestra, the Monteverdi Orchestra, whatever they were. They're all the same bunch of people, the same pool of pickup artists, and, depending on what label they were recording for, they had a different name. Were they ever great? No. Never. They were competent. They were professional eventually, once they learned how to play their instruments. But were they as great as the great orchestras? Of course not. What they did was tell us that the horrid sounds that they were making were somehow authentic. And that because this was historically informed authenticity and original and all of those wonderful terms, people actually got snookered into thinking that music might have actually sounded the way these people were playing it. Now, to some degree, it may have. We don't know. We can't know. But one thing we do know. What we know is that none of those orchestras back in the days had conductors, and none of them had conductors like Roger Norrington. The modern conductor is just that, a modern conductor, the creation of the late 19th century. And Norrington was every bit as much one of those. And that's what makes his success so bizarre. Think about what he was doing. First of all, he was never all that persuasive in music of the classical era, however much he played it. I went to Amazon and took a look when I heard he was retiring and looked at all of his recordings with the London Classical Players. Everything's out of print. He was famous not because he did Haydn and Mozart or even Beethoven the first time around. He became famous because he started doing late Romantic music. And he started playing late Romantic music in the style of what he thought was Haydn and Mozart. Isn't that weird? I mean, think about that for a moment. And that style, which he insisted persisted from the days of Haydn and Mozart all the way up to the Second World War, even though there was tons and tons of evidence that proved that he was just full of crap. But nobody was paying any attention to that. He had his record labels behind him, and he had thoughtless critics behind him and the British musical establishment behind him. Nobody wanted to know what the truth was. They just wanted to promote the guy. That was their job, and promote they did. But just think about that. The idea that the way you played Bach, which was the way he played Mozart, which was the way he played Beethoven, which was the way he played Mendelssohn, which was the way he played Berlioz, which was the way he played Brahms, and then Mahler, and then I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It was all the same. He squished it all into the same mold. And in so doing, he created the most bizarre sound that any conductor has ever created, but it was his. And that's the point. You see, Norrington came along at a time when the record industry was in terrible, terrible shape. It had recorded everything 100 billion times. It had exploited the changeover from analog to digital technology. It had gone through all of the different sound carrier media that were extant at the time in question. And there was tremendous competition between all of the orchestras in the world and everybody to try and do the same music over and over and over again, which was essentially the late Romantic repertoire. And, beginning with, I'll call it Beethoven, early to late Romantic, but 19th century music. That's what the standard repertoire consists of. And to give the record labels an excuse to do it all over again, the period instrument movement had to update itself and start playing that music. So they got behind Norrington because he was one of the first guys to do it. Others eventually did it, but when somebody like Harnoncourt did it with big orchestras and modern instruments, and he applied a few period thingies here and there, but essentially that's what it was. It was modern orchestras and modern instruments. And with Harnoncourt, they were played in the modern way because he was there. He knew that what people like Norrington were saying was absolute balderdash, because Norrington's style consisted of two basic things. One of them was the period orthodoxy, which a lot of people shared. For example, string sections should play without vibrato. Horrible idea and completely historically wrong. But that's okay. That's what they did. And he did that. And then added to that were his own personal quirks, the incredibly clipped articulation, the feminine endings, all of the weird junk he did in interpreting this stuff, which was terribly eccentric. And, Romantic music is eccentric. You can get away with eccentricity in some ways. So on the one hand, here was a guy who was promoting himself as the apostle of authenticity. On the other hand, doing the most inauthentic things that you could possibly imagine. But it didn't matter. And the reason it didn't matter is because it sounded different. And at a time when everybody was playing the same music and everybody was recording the same music, all that mattered was that it should sound different. And if it sounded different, you could promote it. You could talk about it. You could talk about the fact that it sounded different. Of course, nobody had to listen to it. You just had to talk about it. You had to create this mythos, this image of Roger Norrington as the apostle of historical authenticity, evidenced by the really weird sounds that he got his orchestras to make, and particularly the Stuttgart Radio Symphony Orchestra. When he got to Stuttgart, and he got that orchestra, and he turned them into a parody of what an orchestra should sound like. But of course, they got into the habit. German orchestras get into the habit of hiring wackos. They like wackos. They like wackos with a concept. The most famous, of course, was Celibidache. And Celibidache was in Stuttgart, being a wacko before he became a super wacko in Munich. And so the Stuttgart has a, sort of its policy to find wackos. It was the sort of conductorial equivalent of Regie Theater, or whatever you call that thing, Regie Theater. I don't know. I don't pronounce it right. I don't care. Having the director with a concept take the piece and do something bizarre with it. And it doesn't matter how bizarre it is. And it doesn't matter if what they do is idiomatic or actually supports the expressive intent of the composer or the work. None of that matters. All that mattered is that it was different. And Norrington was different. And so he had a career. And good for him. I have always said that he was a complete fraud in what he was doing. I don't know whether he was sincere or whether he really knew he was faking it. I just don't know. But either way, it doesn't matter, does it? He had this huge career of out-of-print recordings. And now it's over. And all I can say is, boy, it's about time. I mean, phew, we dodged a bullet there, folks. Of course, there are plenty of other equally loony people out there. There's Theodore Karensis, who's now in Stuttgart. I mean, you name it, because they're all desperate to do the same thing. They're desperate to personalize what they do. And it doesn't matter how grotesque the performance or the interpretation is, as long as they can say that they made it sound different and they made it sound different in a proprietary way, it's okay, because it gives the PR machine something to grab onto, and it gives these conductors a certain amount of satisfaction in knowing that they are different from everybody else and that they hold the keys to the magic vault of the Empyrean of classical mythology, because that's what these people want to become. They want to be mythological figures. They want to have a mystique about them. And it really disgusts me, I have to say. It's a terrible thing, an absolutely terrible thing. It's terrible for music. It's terrible for listeners who don't know what they're getting and who aren't educated while through the process of listening. You see, the real, I think, sad thing about the whole Norrington career, the Norringtons of the world, is that music teaches you as you listen. It teaches you by the act of listening, simply by opening your mind and letting it pour through you. You become a better listener. You understand what the message is. You know what's going on. And it's just an amazing thing. You don't need to take special courses. You don't need to do anything. But people like Norrington, first of all, destroy the music's ability to communicate that way, quite often as not. And second of all, one of the ways they do it, aside from the self-evident horribleness of their interpretations, is by insisting that people be aware of completely extra musical criteria for performance. That is, the notions of period instruments and authenticity and all of these things that really are completely irrelevant to the experience of the music. They really are. They're totally specious. Even when they get something right, the Norringtons of the world, maybe this was played with a smaller orchestra, or, we know that the instruments didn't have valves, so they use the ones that don't have valves. I mean, even when they get those things right, those are minor points. What matters is the gift of the conductor and the players to realize the music in the most powerful, persuasive, gripping, mesmerizing possible way. And Norrington has substituted for that mysterious, and it is mysterious, element of what we call talent, a simple formula, a recipe. 2 from column A, 1 from column B. Take a valve out here, take the vibrato out there, put the hard stick on the timpani there, and voila, authenticity, validity, legitimacy. And oh, what an awful thing that is. Because music is many things, but one thing it should never be is a simple formula, a formula that you can simply repeat endlessly, no matter what music you're playing, because Norrington played everything the same way. He didn't care. He played it all like Bach, or what he thought Bach should be played like, no matter what period it came from. That's the joke. And the joke was on us. But now the good man is retiring, and I wish him well. I hope he has a very pleasant retirement. I wish him a long life. I know it's been a happy one. I'll bet you it has, because he certainly has had the last laugh. And, now it's done. And I, for one, am awfully glad. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.